The fact is that Islam is many things, many, many things. But to say it's a religion of peace is nonsense. It's to ignore reality. It's to ignore very difficult but necessary facts, not paradigms, but facts. To say that Islam is a religion of peace is to say something based entirely on hope. It's to elevate a hope into truth. And I hope, as you all know, history teaches us that's a very bad thing to do. Thank you.
I was told it's politics. We've heard it tonight many times. It's not the religion. But Islam not only has a pious dimension, but it also has a political dimension, a complex system of laws, a political philosophy on how society should be organized. And if you look at that political system, it's anything but peaceful.
We'll be debating this motion: Islam is a religion of peace. Round one is opening statements by each side, 7 minutes in turn. And I would like to begin by introducing our first speaker for the motion, Islam is a religion of peace. I'd like to introduce Zeba Khan, the only American on our panel and quite possibly the youngest debater ever to take part in an Intelligence Squared U.S. debate. Welcome, Zeba.
I am a Muslim American woman born and raised in Toledo, Ohio, by two very loving Indian Muslim parents. My sister, brother, and I were raised in a middle-class American home. We went to mosque on Sundays, attended Sunday school classes, and prayed the community prayer with our community of Pakistanis, Lebanese, and Syrian Muslims. Now, the motion before you tonight is asking you to determine whether Islam is a religion of peace. And at first blush, that might seem a bit tricky to decide. After all, the Quran and the Hadith have verses in them that point to peace and justice and love. But there are other verses that are about violence and about violence against specific people. So how then do we reconcile these seemingly contradictory verses? How then do we decide whether Islam is a religion of peace? The only way to answer that question is to take an honest look at the people who practice the faith and how they interpret it. According to Gallup's groundbreaking study on what 1 billion Muslims think, 93% of Muslims around the world are peaceful mainstream Muslims. 7% are what Gallup terms as politically radicalized. And within that 7%, there's a smaller percent that has succumbed to the use of violence. Any percent is too much. But we must remember that the violent minority of a minority are motivated by politics, not religion. As Gallup concluded, what distinguishes the politically radicalized Muslims from the mainstream Muslims is their politics, not their piety. Our opponents would have you believe that there's a take-all, no-winners clash between Islam and the West, and that Muslims who try to balance their Western values and Islam arrive at a state of cognitive dissonance and are left either mute or crazy by this internal struggle. That description doesn't resonate for me. Let me be clear. There are some horrifically violent criminals out there who twist our faith to justify their hate and their violence. But I'm here to tell you, they don't speak for Islam. The media and those who profit from the narrative of Islam versus the West are never going to tell you my story or the stories of these Muslims who constitute the vast majority of Muslims around the world. But just because you may not hear us, it doesn't mean we're not speaking out. And just because you may not see us on TV, it doesn't mean we don't exist. If you vote against the motion, I would argue you're voting against the moderate voices of mainstream Islam and telling the terrorists that you agree with their version. I urge you to vote for the motion. Thank you.
Now to speak first against the motion that Islam is a religion of peace, I'd like to introduce Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a very, very well-known dissident born in Somalia, fled to the Netherlands where she was a member of the parliament, the Dutch parliament. Now she's in the United States, once again on a case of asylum because, Ayaan?
Well, because I had to live with, basically, I was afraid for my life.
Ladies and
In
gentlemen.
the 21st century, in a free country.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm surprised by the motion itself. When I first had it, it reminded me of the academic question, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? And I'd think, well, if you do the salsa or the cha-cha, not many. Why are we not having a motion on Is Christianity a religion of peace? Is Judaism a religion of peace, etc.? Because those would be academic motions. Unfortunately, the motion, Islam is a religion of peace, is not academic. I respect and admire Zeba Khan, and I want to acknowledge the fact that you indeed are a demonstration of the assimilation of a Muslim individual, a Muslim woman, into Western society, into an American society, that you come from a middle-class family that was very eclectic and respected pluralism. I respect that very much and I admire you for it, and I think you are an example to others. However, I disagree with you that you represent Islam or that you speak for Islam. The problem that is inherent in Islam from the time of its foundation up to this moment is who speaks for Islam. And I'll get to that later on. Is it Zeba Khan or is it Faisal Shahzad, who was also a middle-class man, went to business school, married an American woman, had 2 children, lived just like you, like many of you, and yet he made a different choice based on a combination of piety and politics. And that's what Islam is. And before I go on, let me define the key terms of the motion. First, religion. The most common definition of religion you will find is the universal quest of humans in search of the sacred or the holy. That search is expressed intellectually, it's expressed in practice, it is expressed in fellowship. And you look at a religion like Islam, on an intellectual level, it was expressed by the founder of Islam as a demolition of all other gods. Polytheism had to end, and all humanity had to be united under one God. From those of you who are familiar with history, and I think a crowd like this is, you know that no monotheistic religion can be a religion of peace. No monotheistic religion is a religion of peace. And definitely not Islam. Monotheistic religions know periods, lengthy periods of peace, but they also know lengthy periods of war. In terms of practice, yes, in Islam, you practice charity, you go to Hajj, you pray, all of that. But in terms of practice, there's also the expression, there's the concept of jihad. And I find it a pity that Zeba Khan did not mention that concept, which is central to Islam's conquests and Islam's success. The founder of Islam, Muhammad, in his lifetime, conducted 65 campaigns of war that were all successful. And that militaristic history of Islam is well documented. Just go Google it. And if you don't find it on Google, go to all those former empires that were conquered. The combination of a history of empire, of conquest, also leaves a legacy behind, and that legacy is the thrusting together of people of different ethnicities, languages, etc. So even if that empire declines, the likelihood of conflict, of war, is probable, it's high, especially where there is a fault line. That's where Samuel Huntington had a point. That history of militarism, combined with the legacy of empire, those 2 points alone belie the motion tonight that Islam is a religion of peace. But that's not all. When empires decline, those who are defeated, and the Muslim empire declined, those who are defeated sometimes find themselves in a state of victimhood. That state of victimhood is exploited by the leadership or those self-appointed leaders of Islam. And what do you see? You see a number of people, and I concede it's a minority, who believe that Islam is under siege. A mentality of victimhood tells those who are conquered, who are vanquished, that the problem was caused by external powers, not by us, and that systematic denial within Islam after the 19th century to blame only outsiders exempt Islam from blame, from the explanation what went wrong. Yes, it was external. Yes, Muslims were humiliated. Yes, they were conquered. Yes, they were colonized. but how much was also because of the flaws of Islam. And that takes me to the point of absolutism. When the West went into its scientific revolution, why wasn't it Muslims? Muslims were the first scientists, arithmetic, logic, etc. They were great. Why didn't they get into that scientific revolution? Why were they left behind? Was it only because of external factors, or were there internal flaws? That combination of a status of victimhood and the absolutism, the demand that you can never revise or reflect on the Quran, that you can never, never, ever refute what Muhammad said, you can only follow his example. That absolutism, combined with that status of victimhood, is also enlarges the likelihood of conflict. And those two combined, like the other two factors,
Ayaan Hirsi Ali, your time is up.
Thank you. That belies the motion. I'll keep my last two factors for the time I have remaining. Thank you.
You have heard from the first two debaters in their opening statements, and now on to the third. I'd like to introduce Maajid Nawaz, who is director of the Quilliam Foundation, and he is in a way has an amazing biography. Several years back would have been America's nightmare. He was a radical. He was imprisoned in Egypt while on a trip there, though he's born in the UK, was in Egypt and tortured for being a radical, and something happened to you in prison. 180-degree turn in one sentence. What was it?
In one sentence.
Yeah.
You're talking about 4 years there.
Yeah.
Amnesty International. But I'll explain that in my hopefully.
Fair enough. Ladies and gentlemen, Maajid Nawaz.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for giving me this opportunity. I want to begin by just stating what this debate is not about. This debate is not about making excuses for terrorism. Basically, my career is to challenge extremism and terrorism in the West and also in Muslim majority countries. I've just flown right in from Pakistan, where I've been building the foundations for the first nationwide social movement to challenge extremism and promote democratic values in Pakistan. This debate is not about making excuses for suicide bombers, even inside Israel. We make no apologies and no excuses on this panel for terrorism, for extremism, and for people who kill innocent civilians, including inside Israel. This debate acknowledges, we on our panel, Zeba and myself, acknowledge that Muslims do need to speak out against extremism and to challenge it, and more Muslims need to do that more actively. We acknowledge that Muslims bear a responsibility in reclaiming their faith from those, the minority, who have hijacked Islam and who have captured the public imagination in their definition of Islam. We acknowledge that, and I am, in my own person, a manifestation of that effort, as is Zeba in the way she was raised. So we acknowledge that as well. This debate, in fact, is an appeal. It's not also, before I move to the fact that it's an appeal, it's also not a threat. So we're not going to argue here tonight that if you don't vote for the motion, that somehow Muslims are going to rise up and attack you for insulting Islam. That's not the case. This is an appeal. And it's an appeal to your good sense and your good character and to what you know inside you. This is actually not a debate for Islam at all. This is a debate for peace. And we are not arguing for Islamic peace. We are arguing for Islam to be, with all other religions and all other beliefs and those who have no faith, to be part of the effort to create peace in the world. I used to believe that Islam is not a religion of peace. In fact, I used to believe that Islam mandates war. I used to believe and propagate across the world, in more than 3 countries, that Islam mandates war and mandates the creation of a state that will have at its heart of its foreign policy a policy to create conquest. I called it jihad. I believed Islam was not a religion of peace because I adopted an ideology at 16 years old and stuck with that until my imprisonment and then after I was released from prison when I was 28 years old. By that time, I had established this ideology in Pakistan and in Denmark and contributed to its growth in Egypt. But I learnt in prison 2 things. One was what I'm appealing to you here today, and that was when people hand out an olive branch, it does work. People I had considered my enemy, people I had considered the enemy of my people, Amnesty International, with their advocation of human rights that I believed was a tool to colonize the minds of Muslims, adopted me as a prisoner of conscience. And by handing me that olive branch, I recognized that there was goodness in the world, and there were people who, regardless of the provocation they find in the world today, are still willing to fight for peace, and are still willing to redefine the debate And that's what I'm asking you to do here tonight. And so I appeal to all of you as my time runs out, there's much more to say, to vote to help us all to redefine this motion, to redefine this world, because only by refusing to accept the paradigms that we find imposed upon us can we refute change. And that's exactly how the civil rights movement in America tackled this issue when they were faced with such situations in the past. Thank you for your patience and thank you for your time.
Our motion is Islam is a religion of peace. And now to speak against the motion, Douglas Murray. He's a best-selling author and founder and director of the Center for Social Cohesion, also a citizen of the United Kingdom, a member of the Church of England. Recently, you said that your study of the Quran, you said this in print, made you an atheist.
That's right. I said Muhammad made me an atheist. The publisher said at the time, that's a pretty provocative headline. I said, well, get somebody to do the next one. She said, I could find a Catholic who could say Muhammad made me a Catholic. I said, how about trying to make it a 3-part article and get a third one, somebody saying Muhammad made me a Jew? And that one would be the trouble.
Douglas Murray, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight. I'm sorry to make this panel rather Brit-centric after my colleague Maajid. This isn't an attempt by us to have a British takeover of the old colony or anything like that. But I was coming earlier from my own fallen empire, referring back to my friend and colleague Ayaan's comments earlier, and I was reading the paper, as I'm sure all of you were doing earlier today. Maajid finished his comments by talking about the importance of changing paradigms. I'm not sure this is about paradigms. I think it's about facts. Here are some facts in my newspaper earlier. The Times Square bomber, of course, a man just up the road from here who tried to kill thousands of people. Only, by the way, didn't manage it because he set the 24-hour timing device to 7 a.m. instead of 7 p.m. 1900 hours was what it was meant to be. If he had have got that bit right, thousands of New Yorkers would have died earlier this year again. I see further in the paper 12 suspects arrested in France in a network trying to recruit people to go and fight American and other troops in Afghanistan. I turn to another page of the newspaper and the city I've just flown off from this morning, a Muslim London Underground worker who was had written to his wife who's off to try to become a martyr for Allah, as he says. He says, more than anything, I wish Allah to grant me martyrdom. And ladies and gentlemen, we have to look at facts. We should also just quickly, if I may, refer something to the wording of tonight's debate. Ayaan's already mentioned this, but let me put it this way. You're I'm sure, liberal-minded New York audience, or at least I hope you are. We'll see. But I imagine that if the motion we had here tonight was Christianity is a religion of peace, we get to the Q&A, perhaps even before, and somebody would say, if the other side were arguing for that, somebody would say, what about the Crusades? What about that? And then there'd be some other clever clogs who'd say, what about that Florida pastor the other week? That was a nasty business. That's Christianity for you. If we'd had tonight, Judaism is a religion of peace, the other side were trying to argue that. Sure as anything. There'd be people popping up in the hall tonight saying, oh, there's this bit in one of the Old Testament books, really, really bad. All sorts of massacres going on. Why don't you talk about that? There might even be people trying to say that the argument that Judaism was a religion of peace couldn't be argued because people would say, look at what Israel is doing. And isn't that a direct response? And so on. So let's not have a debate about Islam and whether or not Islam is a religion of peace without talking about the facts to do with Islam. It's an absurd situation we're in, where nothing that anyone does whilst being Muslim is any responsibility of Islam's. Yet anything anyone does whilst being a Christian or a Jew is responsibility of all Christians, all Jews. Make this as straightforward as I can. Take the categorization that eminent scholars like Bernard Lewis, Ibn Waraq have made. Let's say Islam is a very, very complex thing. And the best way I can do this in the very short time I have is say you have 3 Islams. Islam 1, 2, and 3. Islam 1, the Quran and the life of Muhammad and the Hadith. Islam 2, the tradition of the Sharia. Islam 3, what Muslims do now. The first of those things, Islam, the Quran, and so on, is bad. It is bad. There is a lot of violence in it. And what's worse, the peaceful verses are superseded by the violent verses. The violent verses also, sadly, are more numerous in number. Then you've got the life of Muhammad. Again, a bad man. A very bad man, it has to be said. Not a great role model, if you look at it. Takes child brides, abuses a small girl, multiple wives, himself a warrior, himself a war criminal, himself beheads Jews. This, I would have thought, would be a signal of not great peacefulness. Then you've got the tradition of the Sharia. Again, not great peacefulness. Still no schools of Sharia that people in this hall would want to submit to. And thirdly, what Muslims do now, thankfully, there is some hope in that one. Because most Muslims, thank goodness, I almost said thank God, old habits die hard. Most Muslims don't do what those texts say because they exercise their judgment as moral beings without having to refer to defunct holy books. Now, look, I wish that Zeba and Maajid were the spokespeople of Islam. It would be lovely, although in Majid's case, it would have taken rather too long if everyone had to go for 14 years preaching the downfall of America and then said, no, not so much. But we are... Anyhow, I wish they spoke for Islam. It would be great. But the fact is that tonight, the organizers of this debate asked a number of clerics. None of them would show. Specifically, they wouldn't show and debate against Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Myself, I don't think they cared. But no, it's very interesting that they will not debate. Time and again, the actual leaders of your religion will not debate this. And you're left with people like we have here. The reason why is, of course, is that the leaders of the religion show such terrible lessons. It is not a small thing. It's not as it were a detail. It's not like a wacky Florida pastor. That you've got the largest Sunni state of Saudi Arabia, the most important Sunni state in the world, the most extraordinary closed prison of a society. It's not a detail. It's not a one-off nut job that the Shiite Republic of Iran is what it is, led by the people it's led by. That is not an accident. It's not a detail. The thing that worries me is that although tonight we hear from the fellow panelists here about how Islam is a religion of peace, the fact is that the people who are making the decisions in the religion, the people who are preaching the religion, the heads of that religion, people like Sheikh Qaradawi, who broadcasts anti-Semitic, the most appalling filth every week on the main networks, that is the faith that's speaking for you guys. I wish that, Zeba, you were on every week on Al Jazeera, but you're not. Qaradawi is. The problem is that Islam is an unstable component. As a religion, an unstable component. 1,000 years ago, the Mu'tazilites tried to reform the religion. They were wiped out. The fact is that Islam is many things, many, many things. But to say it's a religion of peace is nonsense. It's to ignore reality. It's to ignore very difficult but necessary facts, not paradigms, but facts. To say that Islam is a religion of peace is to say something based entirely on hope. It's to elevate a hope into truth. And I hope, as you all know, history teaches us that's a very bad thing to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Snow. We have two teams of debaters arguing out this motion. Islam is a religion of peace. The side arguing for the motion, Zeba Khan and Maajid Nawaz, have been make the argument that the extremists do not define Islam. Take away the extremists and you have a religion of peace. The side arguing against, Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Douglas Murray, argue it's not about extremists, it's inherent. It's inherent in the tradition, it's inherent in the scripture, and it's inherent in the history. And to the question of the notion, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, of this not just being about extremists, you concede that there are extremists, but that's, you say, not the problem. What about your opponents? What about your parents? What about Muslims you know who do not adhere to a violent form of religion? Are they, if there's something about the faith themselves, are they embracing spiritually something that is morally an illusion?
Well, my parents and people like my respectful opponents here are ignoring the basic tenets of their religion. When Muhammad, the founder of the religion, called out to all Muslims, and that's how he won most of his wars, by saying, I have been ordered, and all believing men have been ordered to attack and kill and maim anyone unless they testify, unless all men testify to the fact that Allah is the one and only, Muhammad is his messenger. My father disobeys that. Maajid Nawaz tried to obey that first and then stopped obeying it. But the fact that that scripture is there and that history of militarism is there belies the notion that Islam is a religion of peace. The point I want to make is Islam is a religion, when you take the scripture, that can be employed to wage war, and Islam as a civilization has known periods of peace, but you cannot if you pay attention to that history, pay attention to the evidence, continue to say that Islam is a religion of peace. No monotheistic religion is a religion of peace. No monotheistic religion is only a religion of war. It is both. But in Islam, and that's why we are debating it in the 21st century, there are more occurrences of violence and war and strife and subjection of women than there are in other religions. And our point is, let's not deny it, because by denying it, we don't solve the problem. Let's admit it, and then as intelligent people, take it from there. What is to blame on external factors?
Let me
What
go
is
to your,
to
let me go
blame
to your
on the
opponent, Maajid
inside?
Nawaz, who was an extremist, now an anti-extremist. Maajid, respond.
You just quoted a hadith of the Prophet, and you actually really did exaggerate what he said. And I'll quote you the exact hadith in Arabic and then translate it. Now, what you quoted was, well, the hadith is أمرت أن أقاتل الناس
191 to
حتى
193.
Wait, just let
أمرت أن أقاتل الناس حتى يشهدوا أن لا إله إلا الله. Now, what you quoted and in the translation was kill and maim, and you went on and explained. Now, actually, أقاتل means to fight. Now, I'm not saying that that's a good hadith. What I'm saying is when we're translating, let's try and be accurate. And that brings me to the point. And that is that I've just thought of a word to describe this, and it's just come to me, so thank you, because I'm going to use it forever onwards. And that word is suspended intelligence. There's a tendency when discussing Islam to suspend the tools that we have learnt and studied, that you have studied as well, that we use to analyze every other piece of scripture and literature in the world. And that is that we recognize that texts do not speak for themselves. We recognize that when we interpret scriptures and texts and books and poetry, that they are contextualized, that we have methodologies to approach them. When we're reading Shakespeare, when we're reading anything, we recognize that there's a way to interpret text, and there are schools of thought and differences over how to approach texts. Now, if we contextualize Martin Luther and say the Reformation was a good thing, despite the fact that he said, kill and slay the peasants, wherever you find them, when they followed Thomas Munzer, when he was calling for not just breaking away from the papal authority, but also for rebelling against the monarchies and the dictators that they found themselves in. Martin Luther sided with the tyrants against Munzer and said, kill the peasants wherever you find them. Despite that, I'm prepared to say the Reformation was a good thing. And the reason I'm prepared to say that is that Martin Luther must not be judged by the standards of civilization that we, after an accumulation of thousands of years, have arrived at. He must be judged by the standards of civilization that were around during his time. And that's how society evolves. And we recognize that for every other faith and for every other piece of literature. Yet when it comes to Islam, somehow we want to suspend
Douglas
what we've learned about that and quote verbatim from texts.
Yes, we read things in their context. I mean, you read Chaucer in context. Chaucer doesn't have followers. He doesn't have 1.4 billion people who believe everything.
Sorry, I quoted Martin Luther, not Chaucer.
Or are meant to believe everything.
I suppose Martin Luther does have followers.
If you allowed me to speak, I'd address your Luther point. I'll get there, I promise. You don't have followers of Shakespeare who insist on, or are meant to be insist on line by line following everything Shakespeare did and believing everything he wrote. That's because it's literature. Actually, what's happening, Maajid, is you've put your finger on the problem.
Absolutely.
It's not us that isn't applying the rigorous critical faculties. We're applying them to the Quran as we would to any other work of literature. You're not, because you can't. And the final thing on that,
what do you mean he can't? What do you mean that he can't?
Well, because Maajid knows very well
Maajid is a believer. And believers are not allowed to contextualize the text.
Can I bring you back to my question? What about Martin Luther?
Is that
Because
true?
if you were allowed to
Just a moment,
contextualize, you would say some of the things that Muhammad did is crap. You would say some of the things he
Maajid, is it
did
true
was
that you
great.
cannot?
So you contextualize.
Is that true?
No, it's not true. Can I say?
What do you think of Muhammad taking a 6-year-old as a bride? What do you think of that?
I don't think that's a particularly good idea. However, what I would say is that there are many, many people in history that have done such a thing. And what we're talking about here is the failure to contextualize actions for the standards of their time. And I'll come back to the point I made, because Douglas, you didn't address it despite your protestations that you were going to. Now, let me just ask you again. Martin Luther was a fundamentalist, wasn't he?
Absolutely.
All Christians will agree with you that he was a fundamentalist.
Can I now answer Maajid's question?
Yes.
And then I want to bring in Zeba.
If there were currently Lutheran, there are Lutherans around. You meet them occasionally in Scandinavia and so on. Very nice. Very nice it is. And peaceable guys they are by and large. If, however, there was a large proportion of Lutherans somewhere in Scandinavia that started blowing up non-Lutherans, or no, sorry, let's be absolutely right, started massacring peasants, do you think the people would say, hang on a minute, let's not criticize Martin Luther. He did that by the standards of his time. We shouldn't criticize his followers all that much. We shouldn't point out what he said and so on. No, we just say, don't go and massacre peasants. Full stop. It was rubbish at
Douglas,
the time. It's rubbish now. It's the same with the Quran.
You're missing the point. If you're failing to judge...
Nawaz, let me bring in your point.
Sure.
Zeba Khan.
Oh, I just wanted to point out in terms of when we're talking about the Quran and saying that we can't contextualize it, that's simply not true. That is a debate that's hot in the community amongst Muslim scholars and amongst Muslims themselves. We're debating that very question. Is the Quran a living document? Much like it's similar in comparison to, say, the Constitution and the debates that happen around that. Around that. The fact is, scholars say that when you look at the Quranic Arabic, there can be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 interpretations for every word. There's only certain things in the Quran that scholars agree are concrete, like the concept of God, afterlife, things like that. But beyond that, there is a wide range of interpretation, which is why there is a history that not many people look at. And that's part of the problem, that nobody's actually looked at the history of debate within Islam about every sort of aspect that can come to mind.
I disagree with that. The reason why I disagree with it would be more accurate, Zeba, if you said the scholars that you find attractive say that. But there are a bunch of scholars with a great number of following in Islam. All of them are self-appointed, by the way, because there's no hierarchy, there's no seminary of Islam, except University of Al-Azhar, and we know the products of Al-Azhar. But there are scholars like Bin Laden who say we have to take
He's not a scholar by anyone's
he
measure.
has the greatest following. He has
That's
the
not
greatest
true.
following. The Islamic Brotherhood, Hassan
not true.
al-Banna. When you look at the Sunni Islam, when you look at Ayatollah Khomeini in the 20th century, the most influential guy of Shia Islam, another self-appointed scholar, you have all of it. Sheikh bin Baz, he has the greatest following. Sheikh al-Qaradawi. Maybe these are individuals that are not attractive to you, but then it would be more accurate if you stated that. They are attractive to many Muslims, not thousands, but in the millions. And what they say, and that's why they're influential, is they challenge every single Muslim individual. Are you a true Muslim? If you are a true Muslim, you live by what the Quran dictates, you follow the example of the Prophet Muhammad.
Their interpretation,
and those scholars who insist on that are far more influential, far more powerful than you soft-spoken, wonderful, cuddly scholars.
Maajid Nawaz.
Yeah. So, Ayaan, you just quoted Bin Laden as a scholar, Hassan al-Banna as a scholar. Bin Laden, for those of you who don't know, is an engineer, a qualified engineer. So don't know him.
Why don't you define who is a scholar?
Don't know his history. He's a qualified engineer who comes from one of the richest construction families in Saudi Arabia and was educated in the elite private schools of Switzerland and Saudi Arabia. Hassan al-Banna that you referred to was a school teacher. And in fact, what you find common with all of the movements that you're worried about and that I'm worried about and we're all worried about are that they are founded by people who do not have a theological background. Now, for all we think of Al-Azhar and their very conservative views, what we don't find is that Azhar produces the likes of Bin Laden and Hassan al-Banna or even Maududi, the founder of the Jamaat Islami in the Indian subcontinent. Maududi was a journalist. Sayyid Qutb, the founder of modern-day jihadism, was a literary critic who came to America on a scholarship in the 90s to study literature. He was not a theologian. So coming back to the point,
why don't
please,
you name
Ayaan,
a number
don't
of scholars
define
who are
for
influential
the
who
whole
are not?
world who a Muslim scholar is. Because actually the people you refer to were not qualified theologians.
But don't you touch on the problem by admitting this? Don't you touch on the problem that is inherent in Islam after the death of Muhammad? That the problem of who speaks for Islam has not been resolved. It could be the two of you.
Yeah, what's
it
that
could
got
be
to do with
Bin
Islam
Laden.
being a religion
It
of
could be
peace?
Al-Qaradawi. It could be Faisal Shahzad.
Sorry, nothing against engineers in the crowd. Please vote for
what
us,
does that have to do with Islam being a religion of peace? You're almost making the argument that Islam is what you want it to be, depending on how you behave. So if you behave peacefully, is it not a religion of peace to you?
That is a brilliant question. When you can start by saying Islam is different thing to 1.57 billion people. And from that general point, you can reduce it to what is it that unifies them. And ultimately, you will get to the Quran and the Hadith. The Quran, the Hadith, the Day of Judgment, the belief in the Day of Judgment. And if you take those three concepts, then it's far from a religion of peace. Because you look, first of all, not only at the content of the Quran, in context, fine. I'm willing to contextualize it. But what if other believers are not and they're influential? What if I want to read Muhammad's practices simply as a matter of history, another great figure in history? But more Muslims, millions of Muslims don't want to do that
Right,
and
so-
really
so
want to follow
if
his
you're willing
practice.
that you are
What
able to-
if more and more Muslims invest in the hereafter more than they invest in life? Then we have a problem. And that's why I ask you to vote against the motion. It cannot be only a religion of peace. Because if it
Douglas-
were only a religion of peace, if it were perfect, why would we have this debate?
Douglas,
Why would
given-
we
given the
be
long
talking
run
about
that Ayaan
reforming it?
had,
Trying to imply that the whole extremist problem is a sort of misreading by engineers and literary critics. Unfortunately, that's simply not the case, hasn't been historically in Islam, and isn't now. Ayatollah Khomeini, who Ayaan mentioned earlier, was not a self-trained engineer, rich boy like Bin Laden, unfortunately, and managed to hurtle a very developed, distinguished culture back in time in 1979. Hurtled this country back into the state it's currently in under these cloaked dictators.
Okay.
The Grand Mufti of Egypt is
All right,
not
we
a self-taught,
see where you're going, and I don't need
yet
a list.
he taught
Let's see-
people
let's
the
go back
idea
to
that all
Maajid.
Muslims should go and fight the Israelis.
Sorry, on Khomeini, I acknowledge Khomeini is a trained theologian, and the fact is he came in the 70s, Douglas, and that proves something. What was he so famous for? Khomeini was recognized for bringing a revolution in Shiite theology. And what was the revolution? Those of you who've studied this will know that the revolution was that up until him, Shiites had been avowedly religiously secular because they believed no one had the right to rule in God's name until the Messiah came, and let them wait for that Messiah until the end of time. Khomeini changed that and turned it on its head. And if that proves something, it proves one thing, and that is it was not consistent with Islamic Shiite tradition. What he did was a very modern revolution influenced by his studies in Europe and influenced by modern European fascism. He broke from tradition, and that's why it was called a revolution. He was not a continuance of Shiite
It's
tradition.
the fault of the Europeans, in other words. It's
no,
external.
no one's saying it's
Remember the
no,
victim
come on,
status.
no, seriously.
It's
All
not
right,
a
I
turn.
want
Let's
to
not
bring
get-
Zeba in.
let's go
Zeba,
back.
I want to ask
Yeah.
you something about reforms for Islam. Does Islam need reform?
It needs a renaissance. It doesn't need a reform. Reform in the sense, and the reason I say that is because we have to be careful of our terminology. If we say reform as in Reformation, we're thinking of a Christian context where you had the Protestants and Martin Luther saying, rejecting the Catholicism and the Pope. But the thing is, in Islam, there is no Pope. There is no centralized authority. So there can't be a reformation in that sense. What there needs to be is a return to genuine Islamic principles, which have been not studied, have not been enforced and are forgotten. So it's not exactly that.
I
But
wanna
a return to genuine Islamic principles is exactly what Al-Qaeda is advocating.
No, that's not
It's
actually what they're.
exactly
No, that's
what
actually
all-
incorrect.
A return, a rebirth,
Al-Qaeda, so the difference between Al-Qaeda
is exactly
I'm
what
sorry,
all those
the
extremist
radio cannot make
organizations
sense of two
are.
voices, and I'm talking now too at the same time.
Yeah.
So I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to give you 20 seconds to make that point, and then I want to hear back. So think 20 seconds.
When you look at the extremist the organizations that we've come to call extremist, what they're advocating when they answer the question, what went wrong? We had this empire. We lost it. How do we regain it? Their answer is a rebirth. Let's go back to the origins, a revival of it. Is that what you want, Zeba?
No, they actually covert the language for their own political purposes. Al-Qaeda is not calling for a return to Islam or to original Islam or anything like that. They're actually using Islam as a cover for their political grievances. When you look and ask Muslims, ask 1.5 billion Muslims, when you look at the mainstream, they're 90%. They're peaceful and fine. When you look at the politically radicalized, when you ask them, what do they fear most? They say Western domination and occupation. But when you ask mainstream Muslims what they fear, they say economic issues, unemployment. There's a clear difference. And so they're not, what we can determine from that is that it's not religion, because religiosity between the two is indistinguishable. How pious they are, indistinguishable. It's the one factor that makes the difference is what they focus on and their grievances against, perceived grievances against the West.
Douglas Murray.
But don't we get back to one of the core problems which you still haven't addressed, which is the life of Muhammad and his teachings, which is as follows. Is that if a Christian group decides to go back to the teachings of Christ, the worst stuff they find is the Sermon on the Mount of Olives. They can find one verse where Jesus is said, I think the Gospel of St. Matthew, to have said, I come not to bring peace but a sword. But the rest of it is all love thy neighbor and all that sort of stuff. If you're a Christian group looking to go back to the sources of Christianity, you just find a lot of well, hippie stuff for a lot of modern people. So what is it about this religion we're talking about tonight that you say is a religion of peace, that when people go back to the origins, they find a founder who was violent, teaching violence?
Here in the West, one of the issues that is very complicated for people in coming to terms with what they think Islam is the status of women in Islam. But to Zeba Khan, take that on. You know what I'm talking about.
The perception is that for a lot of people out looking at the Muslim world, Muslim majority countries, is that Muslim women are somehow, they're subjugated, that they don't, to a point where they are intimidated to ask for their rights and to demand them. But that's not the case. I mean, when you look across Muslim majority countries, if you look at Iran, for example, where there's zero gender gap in education, by the way, men and women enjoy the same amount of education. Obviously, when you're at that level of education, you're aware of what your rights are and what you are demanding. And so in Iran, in places like that, they are demanding their rights. They are pushing for them. In places like Afghanistan or Pakistan, where the gender gap is larger, that gap obviously needs to be filled. But there are women who are pushing there as well. It's women that are stepping up and taking the lead on this.
Other side response? Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
When I try to define Islam as a religion, there is expression. You find in the Quran is expression after expression, verse after verse, and also in the Hadith that women are subordinate to men, that they have a guardian, they need to have a guardian. Their testimony is worth half of that of men. They can only inherit half of what their brother inherits. When it comes to sexual offenses, women are the ones who get, in reality, where Sharia is implemented, and that is not only the practical side of Islam, but also the fellowship side of Islam, everywhere where Sharia is implemented. And there are more places in the world today where Sharia as a family law is implemented, where it's not implemented on a political level. But in all of those places, you see a subjugation of women. You see honor killings. You see women who are denied education. If you look on a global level, the levels of illiteracy among women in the Middle East is appalling. That's not something that I'm telling you because I'm, whatever, I misunderstand Islam, but that is report after report. And the latest one is the United Nations UNDP Human Development Report that was first published in 2002, and that was again published in 2003, 2004. And if you follow these reports, this is empirics. This is not something that I'm imagining. The situation of women in the Middle East, in Muslim countries, is dire. And the principles that underlie it and the practices are Islamic. It's Sharia law in action. And the nightmare is women who have fled those countries, who are now in the West, American citizens, European citizens, are subjected to parts of Sharia law. And Zeba, I think that denying that, kind of not just as a matter of debate, but I then try to question, where does your solidarity lie as a woman who grew up in a free country, a free woman, and as vocal as you are, shouldn't you be more solidar with them?
I am.
Zeba Khan.
I am, but I absolutely am, and as all women should be, and actually all human beings should, to demand the rights of equality. In fact, most Muslims want equal rights for the women in their societies. If it goes to, just go to the research, go to the polls, go to the research on what it says. When you ask men, should women have equal rights? Majority in the countries surveyed, in the Gallup survey, said yes, they should have equal rights, including in Saudi Arabia.
May I say, it's a bit too cutesy to compare a man who raped a 9-year-old girl repeatedly with men being, the wife's a bit of the master of the household and so on. A bit too cutesy and a bit too much avoiding the issue, which is this. And this is actually a very real concern, which doesn't just apply in mid-7th century Arabia, but today, here and now, in Britain, in my own country. We now have, thanks to an arbitration act put into a law in the 1990s, whereby people can have civil disputes arbitrated under laws that they can decide on, that we now have Sharia courts in Great Britain. And the Sharia courts that in Great Britain are operated by people who are actually clerics. They are religious authorities. There's one at the moment, Siddiqui in Leicestershire. And now this man runs a set of Sharia courts. A couple of years ago, it turned out that we found out a little bit about the sort of thing he was deciding. And sadly, again, it's not reformist stuff, because when you go back to the Sharia, people take the lessons from it and they make judgments like the following. 6 women who had gone to the Sharia courts because they were being physically abused by their husbands, they were persuaded to drop the cases because this should be a matter between a Muslim woman and her Muslim husband and the Sharia court. This should not be a matter for the police in Great Britain in 2008. That stinks. What's more, there was in another case, a local Muslim man died. His will was arbitrated by Sharia because that was what happens now in 21st century Britain. And the arbitration of this man's will gave half the inheritance to the daughters as to the sons of the man, because that's what you have in the Quran.
But
so it's all very well to say
Maajid just
that it's
actually
something
said that he agrees with you that this stuff needs to change.
But the point is that when you look at the courts that are doing this, when you look at the religious authorities, when you look at the clerics, the judgments they're making, those are the kinds of judgments. I wish that Maajid would get some clerics on his side who could set up rival Sharia courts that didn't decide that women were second-class citizens. But sadly, at the moment, that is the case.
Sharia courts in the UK was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and we at Quilliam opposed their creation. And actually, many Muslims in Britain do oppose their creation because it raises the question. Islam has never had a clergy. It's never had a pope. And so when you try and institute Sharia courts as law, the question arises, whose Sharia do you follow? Now, that's an internal debate that's going on and raging, and that I'm part of in Pakistan, for example, because there isn't one version of Sharia, and everything you've referred to is bad. Condemn these practices. But the fact is, we can't be reductionist, essentialist, simplistic, lack nuance and call it Sharia, because there isn't one Sharia, as you well know, just as there isn't one reading of Shakespeare.
All right, I want to move on. And when we come back, we're going to take questions from the audience. All right, so we're going to go to questions from the audience now. And if you raise your hand, what I'll do is take a cluster of questions and then start presenting them to the panel. And I just want to remind you, if you'll get a microphone, please stand up and hold it about 2 fists away from your mouth so that the radio can pick you up. And please keep it as terse as possible right against the wall there. And blue shirt here and eyeglasses and green. All right. So you get 30 seconds to ask your question. It makes me nervous that you've got something written down on a piece of paper.
Under 30 seconds, I promise.
All right, go ahead.
Zeba, in your opening remarks, you said that Islamic terrorists are motivated by politics, not religion. Considering that Islamic terrorists make up the majority of suicide terrorists in the world today, what's happening to Muslims politically that isn't happening to any other major religious group that can account for the disproportionate amount of terrorism coming out of the Islamic world?
Bingo. That was a good question.
Yeah, that's
Under 30 seconds?
Yeah, that was a great question.
Your number, I'm going to take the questions and
sorry.
then number 2. Yeah. Yes, I'm ready for you. Oh, I'm sorry, there with the microphone. Yes, you, sir.
My question is relatively similar, but I'll make it. This has to do with the Muslim community's reaction to suicide bombings. You stated there's 1.5 billion Muslims, and yet the silence of this community on suicide bombings, the justification, the rationalization, the wiggles from the community, from the religious community, from the Muslim states, Arab states and Muslim states, is something that in the West we find puzzling. How would the panelists react to that?
Thank you. And third question?
I hope this isn't too naive, but if Islam is not a religion of peace, is it possible for it to become one?
That's a
Well, I think that's a great question, actually. I was trying to get at that with the reform issue, but I just think you put it far more eloquently. So I'm going to take all those questions because I thought they were all good. Zeba, do you want to take the response to the first one? Basically, why the preponderance of terrorism, the questioner is saying, is committed by Muslim extremists. Why are we not seeing that happening from other groups?
So what I can't say is, I know that it's a complicated question. And so you have history involved, you have different factors that contribute to the answer. What I can say for sure, just based on looking at the studies that come out, is that the level of religiosity, the level of piety of violence of terrorists compared to mainstream Muslims is virtually, there's no difference. So it's literally, when you ask them how practicing they are, how often do they attend services, things like that, it's literally the same. So that can't be the distinguishing factor. But what we do know, as I mentioned earlier, is when you ask them, the one big difference is when you ask them what they fear the most. And they say their perceived idea of Western domination, which is very similar to what we hear from our opposition, a perceived fear of Islamic domination. And so when you compare that to the mainstream, who just want to get a job.
Would the other side like to respond to that question as well? Or to the answer that you heard? And if not, we'll move on.
ideology that the Arabs adopted who were resisting. Initially, it was Arab socialism, Baathism, and that morphed into Islamism, which owes much of its origins to Arab socialism. And so what we find is that the spread of this ideology, pretty much like how post-World War I Europe, with the identity crisis that emerged after the Weimar Republic, led to the growth of fascism in Europe, with fascism in Italy, Nazism in Germany, and totalitarian Stalinism in the USSR, we see the same thing playing out post-empire in the Middle East. So what it's related to is the spread of this ideology that has hijacked the minds of many young Muslims. And yes, Muslims need to do more to challenge this ideology. We are trying to convince them of that. But this is a very modern phenomenon. I remind you, Khomeini is a modern phenomenon, and he created a revolution where he flipped Shiite theology on its head, as are the others. Bin Laden, Sayyid Qutb, they are all modern phenomena.
Okay, Maajid, you have awakened the other side on this topic.
Yes, because
Should have kept my mouth shut.
Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
Maajid, what you're saying is Islamism is invented by the British. Islamism has nothing to do with Islam. External. Those poor Muslims who are seduced with the Quran and the activities of Muhammad, their own culture, their own convictions, their own history, they are only the victims. Ideas inspire, ideas unite, ideas people bring together. And Muhammad succeeded first and foremost in uniting a disparate Bedouin desert Arab group of people. And they unified and they conquered. And when it worked, it was all Islam. When Muslims were successful, when they conquered lands, it was all great. It was Islam. Now that we're faced with this problem, it's Islamism, and it was created by the British Empire. I just want the other side. I don't think we will ever be able to address this issue if we systematically refuse to acknowledge, and that is what that side of the panel is doing. So let me finish it. Yeah. To systematically refuse to acknowledge the flaws of Islam. I grew up as a Muslim. I left Islam. Why did I do it? Because I couldn't hide away from the blemishes. And I believe we can improve that. I can believe we can inspire young Muslims and the youth bulge. There are millions and millions of young Muslim men under the age of 30. That in itself is a source of violence without it being Muslim. We can inspire them if we can only acknowledge that part of the problem is us, not just the British Empire.
I'm not saying it's the fault of the British. If I was going to say that, I would have joined a very successful British law firm.
What has Islamism got to do with Islam?
I'm saying to you, I would have been a lawyer and I would have got on with my life. I'm taking responsibility for that, and I'm trying to get others to take responsibility for the growth of Islamism within Muslim minds and challenge that. So no one's blaming the British and no one's claiming
the second question was on the topic of, and you almost got to it in your last answer, Maajid, but the second question was, where is the clear-cut, broad condemnation of terrorism from Muslim leaders?
Yeah, so there have been many such fatwas or pronouncements against suicide bombings. In many cases, they're not reported. There does need to be more. However, I'll give you an example of why in some cases there aren't more. Now, recently we at Quilliam publicized a fatwa by Dr. Tahir al-Qadri against terrorism. No ifs, no buts, condemnation of suicide bombing and terrorism that Douglas, always a pleasure to speak with you on the panel, supported and was quoted in the press as supporting Dr. Tahir al-Qadri's fatwa against terrorism. Now, the reason why there aren't many more such examples, though there are quite a few, is because prior to Dr. Tahir al-Qadri issuing this fatwa, his colleague, who was also from the same way of thinking, was assassinated in Pakistan, was killed by a suicide bomber in a mosque where all the other congregants who were praying were also blown to smithereens because he had the guts to simply give a sermon in that mosque condemning suicide bombings. And so this is why many people are scared, because it takes guts, I tell you, to go into Pakistan and try and challenge these extremists. That's a country that doesn't have much rule of law. It's a country that's struggling against the so-called Pakistani Taliban from taking over a third of their country. And they're fighting that fight on the front lines. And there are those who are brave enough just to give a speech to condemn terrorism, and they're blown to smithereens in their mosque while praying.
Imagine.
And surely they're religious people. They were praying in a mosque, Douglas. You did support that fatwa, though, didn't you?
I did. It's the only time I've ever done a book review of a fatwa. I'm sorry to say this, Maajid, you seem to have just proved our point.
Yes.
I mean, I'm very grateful. It's a very important and very interesting question, why more people don't stand up. I much admire al-Qadri for that fatwa, as I have other people who have stood up. But the number of times I've spoken to clerics behind closed doors and so on, and you say, why aren't you saying anything? They say, because if I do speak up, I'll be killed. Well, I address you again, ladies and gentlemen, to the motion.
No, hold on. I'm sorry. Right, hang on. How on earth does fear of being killed in Pakistan by a minority faction of extremists prove Islam is not a religion of peace?
Let me put it this way.
Sorry, I've got to, because really what you've just said is really quite absurd, and I've got to clarify. It takes one person to kill all of us here. One person in a suicide bombing. Now, if we were scared of saying what we're saying now because of that one person, it doesn't mean all of us love war and hate peace in any way whatsoever. It means we all fear that one person who could walk through that door with a suicide bomb jacket strapped to his chest.
If we were
That's
discussing
an absurd
Quaker,
argument.
does anyone think that when a Quaker said, I'm quite fearful about speaking up against certain things, come on, this only happens with Islam. There is no other major faith in the world today where it is the case that people are fearful of addressing religion because they're afraid they'll be killed. It's only Islam. And we're saying there's a reason.
I'm afraid of being killed by apostates.
Yes,
and many of you who came here tonight came under unusual circumstances. I'm not in government. I'm not a powerful person. I'm a citizen. Just a normal, ordinary person.
Can you explain what you mean by unusual circumstances?
Unusual circumstances. You went through metal detectors to come to a debate in New York. Talk about
That's because it takes one person to get through those metal detectors and blow us up. It doesn't mean the majority of people are terrorists.
Let me finish. The people that I am protected against, and you as an audience too, the individual who wants to kill me because I'm an apostate of Islam is inspired to do that from the scripture of Islam, example of the Prophet Muhammad, the clergy that preached to him, and the reward he will get in the hereafter that is promised in the Quran. All of that is Islamic. The sooner you admit that, the sooner I can get rid of my bodyguard.
He's inspired. I'll tell you what he's inspired by. Right.
Maajid, I want to have the last word on this point because I want to go back to the young lady's question.
Sure. So I tell you, he's inspired by the very same interpretation of Islam that you have. He's not inspired by Islam. He's inspired by your interpretation of it, that is Bin Laden's interpretation of it.
Sorry.
That is Sayyid Qutb's interpretation of it. And I've got to say one last thing. I've got to say one last thing. The thing is, you're not the only one on this panel. I have an Al-Qaeda death threat on my head too because I'm saying what I'm saying. And what I'm saying is, and I've been attacked in Pakistan physically for saying this, what I'm saying is, enough to extremism, enough to terrorism. Let's separate Islam from extremism and disempower the minority of extremists who are trying to hijack a good faith.
Douglas, you've had death threats.
Points about this area is everyone gets death threats. It's just an unfortunate thing
I think
about this
Zeba and I are
debate.
going to leave.
As I say again, I think it speaks for itself. I hope no one threatens a chair.
Can you repeat the question that I liked so much?
Yes.
Islam is not a religion of peace. Is it possible for it to become one?
My answer is yes, on condition that, first of all, Islam is not a religion of peace, and I hope that we have demonstrated here tonight that it's not. Can it become a religion of peace? Yes, if a number of conditions are met.
But what is it for all of the people who practice it peacefully?
But let me complete the conditions.
What is that faith that
and
they're
not only
practicing? That's the part that I'm not finding in your explanation.
Why are we having, again, over and over again, first of all, in my view, no monotheistic religion, because there's that divider between we and they, because when that's unifying, there are so many factors within every monotheistic religion that make it inherently aggressive. It's not only Islam. But there are a number of factors that in the 21st century combine. Again, there's the history of militarism and the awareness of that. There's the victim status. There's the youth bulge. Let's not forget that. There's the revival of that theology, the revival of the example of the Prophet Muhammad, the investment in the hereafter. And you say a lot of people practice the religion in peace. What we know is that a lot of people are passive and are actually not practicing their faith, are not practicing Islamic scripture.
Who are you to say who's practicing their faith and who's not?
Let me finish.
It's not for you to decide. I'm the Muslim. You're not.
But let me finish. Let me finish. You are not practicing. You are
really?
Not practicing.
Are you Sheikh?
No, but let me say,
Sheikh,
you are not practicing.
Let's hear what she says.
Wait a minute. I want to
Please,
finish.
let's hear what her point
You
is.
are not practicing chapter 2 of the Quran, verse 191 and 193, and slay them wherever you find them, and drive them out of places whence they drove you out, for persecution of Muslims is worse than the slaughter of the non-believers.
Let there be no compulsion in
not.
religion.
Yeah.
Chapter
so,
2.
Okay.
To each community.
which has given direction as it follows. All of you compete in the performance of good
This
deeds.
could go on
So
for a
which
very long
point?
time.
We have so many verses.
No.
So that's not a reliable
That's my
argument.
point.
Let's
That
have one
proves
person
my
speak
point.
at a time.
If
and
you
will come
read
back.
the peaceful,
Ayaan, start again because I was talking.
that proves my point. If you read from the Quran and you say it's a religion of no compulsion and you believe that that verse is practiced by a person like you will concede that there are other Muslims who will read the verse that I just quoted and be inspired to engage in acts of violence. And by the way, the verse that you just read, it has a latter part that says, the unbelievers.
Sure, I'm sure every part does, and I can look at the Old Testament.
But I
and New
wanted
Testament
to
the same
complete
thing.
the answer to the question.
Let's Zeba answer this.
Sorry, what was?
Well, my last point was that is both. It's not just a religion of peace; it's also a religion of war, and both verses prove
Okay.
that.
Do you want to respond to that, Zeba, or do you want to?
I think I'll have to come back.
Okay. Douglas.
That is an important one. Ayaan and I and people who make some of the points we make are often accused of taking bits of the Quran out of context. I think you've just seen a very good example of it from the other side. I'm not saying that that isn't a good verse to live one's life by. One cannot just simply quote the verse about there being no compulsion in religion as though it doesn't
quote
have
the other ones either
a
without
follow-on.
context.
It has
As
a
though it
follow-on.
doesn't
So
have a
do those
follow-on. And as
ones.
Ayaan has just showed you,
As
it
do
has a
those ones.
follow-on. So I think this gets back to the very important question the lady halfway back there made, which is whether or not this can be a religion of peace. I believe it can be. And when I said earlier there are three types of Islam I identified, I said the first one, the scriptures, the life of Muhammad and so on, bad. Second one, Sharia, interpretations, bad. But thirdly, the way Muslims live their lives today in this country and countries like it, that is our source for hope. And the source of hope for that is that they individually use, like many people do religion. I'm not a religious person. Ayaan isn't either. But we recognize the fact that people of religious faith have the right to that faith, should practice that faith, should have no fear of practicing that faith. There's no problem with this. But it's a private matter and one which people come to very strange private arrangements about. And I just wanted to add this, which is that if those people are going to be able to reform that faith into the religion of peace you're talking about, then yes, we would be the first people to encourage them. But if we're going to have that debate, as I hope we've shown tonight, it has to start with honesty.
Let's do one more round of questions.
With frankness.
Wait, Donna, do we have time for one more round? Yeah. So I'm going to do it again. I would love to hear from an audience member who is a member of the Muslim community.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If you feel like speaking. And not that I'm profiling, but I saw a lot of blonde people raising their hands. And again, I realize it's a complex world.
Jihad Jane was
That
blonde.
kind of profiling is allowed.
All right, I'm going to take something from the left. Yes, blonde person, you can go. Anybody from the? Yeah, okay, go ahead. And then on the right side, yes, ma'am, I see you. Yep. So, again, remember that way that great question was phrased. That's how you do it.
So, for those in favor of the motion, my question is what she just read from the Quran. You expressed that you didn't agree with it. Clearly, you're interpreting the religion as you will and in a very peaceful way, which is great. Do you ignore those parts? How do you react to it? You said there were multiple ways, just like we interpret the Constitution. There are multiple ways to interpret what the Quran is saying. I just want to know exactly how you interpret that chapter she just read to us.
Thank you. To that end, I happen to be Roman Catholic, but my wife is Israeli and my son just went through his bar mitzvah. There was some pretty spicy stuff in Leviticus.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
But then
I had no
Catholicism went through the Reformation and Enlightenment.
Yes.
I'm from Pakistan. I'm a Muslim from Pakistan, and I just want to comment on the suicide bombings. There's one almost every week. And if you feel that as a nation, after being destroyed repeatedly since 9/11, we would still be sympathetic to extremist sentiments when our, two of my students were killed in suicide bombings.
But what is your question?
My question is, I want you to consider what the value of socio-economic, cultural factors, political dictatorships. What role do those factors play in making young people susceptible to extremism?
Do you not feel that Maajid covered that in his remarks? Because I feel that he did.
Well, I don't think the audience understands.
Let me put it on hold then, and then the third person.
I have a question for Ayaan Hirsi Ali. I'm a Muslim woman, and she was referring to the subjugation of women. This has to do with the subjugation of women. I'm from India, and my question is, if women are not educated, in a lot of Muslim countries, that's the problem, that the education, women are not educated. And when they're not educated, they don't know what their rights are. And so they're not going to demand their right. That's the whole point in not educating half the population. But my question to you is, what does that have to do with Islam? Because according to my understanding of the Quran, the first word that was revealed of the Quran to Prophet Muhammad was read. It had to do with education. And the Quran...
So can you give me a question in one sentence? Yeah, I know you can. Go for it.
Well, my question is, what does that have to do with Islam? Because the Quran doesn't say that, according to my understanding. Education, it doesn't say educate men, do not educate women. Nowhere in the Quran have I found that.
Let's take that last question first.
I want to agree. Thank you so much for that question. I completely agree with you that women in the Muslim world today, not all of them, but most of them, are denied education. The reasons that are given by those who do the denying are Islamic. They refer to the concept of guardianship. So the guardian has the authority to decide whether he sends a girl to school or not, and for how long she goes to school. The main reason in Muslim countries where girls are sent to school, Muslim communities where girls are sent to school, the main reason for pulling them out at the age of menstruation is the fear, the terror that they might lose their virginity. That modesty, sexual modesty that is demanded of girls, which at first it preceded Islam. It was a tribal Arab culture elevated to religion in Islam, where people find within the Quran that in the Hadith, that insistency on her virginity, on her being a virgin on the night of her wedding, that is one of the main reasons that is given. And if sexual emancipation were to occur within the Muslim world, and I want to challenge a guy like Maajid Nawaz to take the forefront as a man by saying that you value a partner, a human being, more than her hymen, that would revolutionize Islam completely. It would take, girls would go to school, they would be independent, they would be able to articulate what their rights are, and more importantly, they could make Islam a religion of peace because they would bring their boys up to be employable, to be educated, and to renounce suicide, killings, and martyrdom. Uneducated mothers are mothers whose children, whose boys, bad guys can take advantage of.
We're at the point where normally we move on to our third round. We have these two questions standing out there, and I'm going to extend, with everybody's acceptance, a few minutes of this section tonight. Nobody seems to be leaving, and no one's asleep. So, Jid, if you can be very brief to that, and then I want to get to the last question.
To be honest, I value a can of Diet Coke more than a hymen. I mean, really, everything's more valuable to me than a hymen, and especially a woman. So I really don't understand the point of your question there. But allow me to say, however, that every Muslim questioner from the audience today is not a true Muslim, and every one of you may be a Christian is not really a Christian, and any of you may be a Jew is not really a Jew, because I have the absolute monopoly of defining all three of those religions for all of you. And really the passages that, because I'm saying this because of the first question, and that is the passages that were referred to about fight them wherever you see them. Now, the thing is, really, the founding fathers of this great country who wrote the Constitution believed in slavery and were practicing slavery. Now, does that mean that we're going to define the whole of America and its Constitution by that practice? Or are we going to contextualize that practice and say that when they founded this country, slavery and abolishing slavery was not at the forefront of their minds, but later on it was abolished, and that's an achievement for this country. It's not something that defines this country. And so, likewise, these passages, yes, they can be used, and they are used in a problematic way. And it's our responsibility, not just as Muslims, but as decent human beings, to go out there and challenge the abuse of these passages. But we must not forget that, as with every other document in history, it had its context and it was abused. And now, when we have gone ex post facto, we can look back to that and judge it with the very civilized standards that we've arrived at and say, that was wrong. Now, perhaps
let me put
I may be defined as uncivilized.
I want to put the question as it was phrased to Zeba, which was, how do you filter out? Right, exactly. How do you filter that out?
How do I interpret is what you're asking? Despite what our opposition says, I do have that right. And basically, I look at my faith. I'm sorry, who asked the question? I look at my faith and the way I was raised with core Islamic principles, which is how my family raised me, and that I determined as an adult were correct. which is compassion and tolerance and plurality and strength and diversity, because we are a diverse population. There are as many interpretations of Islam as there are people. And so the other point I want to make to that is that there are clergy and clerics who are who do stress this. I mean, if you look at 2005, at the Amman message, where 200 Muslim scholars from 50 countries stressed a re-emphasis of Islam's core values of compassion, mutual respect, acceptance, freedom of religion. There is precedent for this, not just for me as a layperson, but from the clergy as well, to reassert these lost, in some areas, lost values.
Douglas Murray.
I do have to. This is a very, very complex one, but this has to be said. Well, Maajid's just given the comparison with the founding fathers, and there has to be some clarity about this. This country rightly reveres your founding fathers, but you don't think that their word was immutable or unchangeable. You don't believe, I don't think that anyone in this room who criticized Mr. Jefferson now here tonight will be declared an anti-American apostate who can be fit for slaughter. The problem that our opponents have to address, this, is that in a religion which is based on the idea that the Quran was dictated direct by God to Muhammad, and that therefore if you are criticizing the Quran or throwing out bits or pulling it apart, like most Christians and Jews have come to that stage, would pretty much pick a mix with your holy scriptures, and it's quite a good, humane way around it. But with Islam, if this is the revealed word of God, revealed, it has to be said, as it was shown again earlier tonight, in a particularly obscure and unreadable dialect, which, if it was meant to be understood by the whole of the world, it's a bad place to start. If this were the case, then, as I say, we come back to this problem. The founding fathers said many great things and did some bad things, but you are not committed as Americans not to criticize the bad things they did. And this is a problem our opponents are going to have to address.
And that concludes round 2 of our debate. So here's where we are. We are about to hear brief closing statements from each debater. They will be 2 minutes each, and this is their last chance to change your minds and to respond to some of what's been said over the last hour. You will be asked to vote once again and to pick the winner just a few minutes from now. But first, on to round 3, closing statements. Our motion is Islam is a religion of peace, and speaking first against the motion, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and a critic of fundamentalist Islam.
Islam is not a religion of peace, and I woke up to the facts on the 11th of September 2001. Perhaps I should have woken up to the facts earlier, but I admit that I did that then at that time. Talking to people of my faith, Islam, and my friends, and discussing with them, I remember all kinds of fallacious arguments, but I remember one consistent thing, and that was to exempt Islam from any criticism. It was culture. It wasn't Islam. But a religion is born in a culture. And if that culture is not peaceful, then that religion is not peaceful. I was told it's politics. We've heard it tonight many times. It's not the religion. But Islam not only has a pious dimension, but it also has a political dimension, a complex system of laws, a political philosophy on how society should be organized. And if you look at that political system, it's anything but peaceful. What emancipated me from the order to submit my will completely to Allah, which in practice means the concentration of power in the hands of a few, was to learn to think critically, the Enlightenment. Vote against this motion and open up the flows of Islam for debate in order that Muslims, those who are not yet emancipated, may take charge of their own reason, of their own faculty. Vote against the motion that Islam is a religion of peace and toss that fallacy into the trash can of history.
Douglas Murray, bestselling author, founder, and director of the Center for Social Cohesion.
Thank you. Well, thank you for a very enlightening, I think, debate tonight. I think we, on this side, made it very clear that we don't think there's a fight between Islam and the West, or Islam and civilization, or anything else like that. We've made a very clear set of points tonight. And one of those points, which I hope people will bear in mind, is we have said repeatedly that it is in Muslims and their critical faculties, Muslims and their behavior, Muslims and their faith, that we have hope. And it is in people like you that we have hope for the future. And if the motion were that Islam a century from now could be a religion of peace, and people would be quoting Zeba and Maajid and seminal moments like this, and that they had learned, well, that would be terrific. But at the moment, tonight, you're being asked to vote on whether Islam is now a religion of peace. Is Islam a religion of peace? I think it is very clear that it is not. This does not mean, of course it doesn't mean, that Muslims are all violent. We would never make that point. We never have made that point. Nor does it mean that there isn't hope in the future. Nor does it mean that we have to have continual clashes till the end of time. But it means we have to start by being honest. We have to be frank about what we see in Islamic history, in Islamic conquests, and in Islamic scripts. We have to be frank about that. In societies which Islam dominated, conquered, and subdued the peoples in the Middle Ages, people who were not Muslims were sometimes allowed to remain in those societies, but they were allowed to do so only by having second-class status, dhimmi status. I would ask you tonight, ladies and gentlemen, not to be dhimmis, not to have second-class status, not to vote for things because you think it's polite or because you think you have to say them, but because you think they're true. On that basis, the idea you could vote for the motion tonight is absurd. Islam is palpably, demonstrably, evidently not a religion of peace. Vote against this motion. Thank you.
It's all in now. I've been given the results. Remember, the team that changes the most minds is declared our winner. And here it is. Our motion is Islam is a religion of peace. Before the debate, 41% were for the motion, 25% were against, and 34% were undecided. After the debate, 36% are for the motion, 55% against, 9% undecided. The side against the motion wins. Congratulations to them.